بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين. So, just to follow on with the Seerah, last week we finished from the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ had already been born last week, and after he was born there was a few things which happened. So fundamentally his aqiqah was done, his name was kept, and we went into the details of these. And then after the Prophet ﷺ went out to the village, and then after that the Prophet ﷺ, he had his upbringing between the ages of 3 to 5, from when he was born until about 6 years old, he was in the village, and there his chest was split as well. That story was mentioned as well. Then after this, when he was 6, he came back, his mother passed away, and then 2 years later, when he was in the care of his grandfather also passed away. After this, he went into the care of his uncle, whose name was Abu Talib. And then so today inshallah we'll carry on from the moment where he's in the care of Abu Talib. So this started obviously at the age of 8. So at the age of 8 is when his grandfather passed away. So when his grandfather passed away, his grandfather, before he passed away, he made this pledge to him. He made this request to his uncle that make sure you look after the Prophet ﷺ properly. So when he did pass away, then there was a lot of love from Abu Talib to his nephew, to the extent people say that Abu Talib loved his nephew more than he would give love to his own children as well. So this is one of the amazing things we find about the Prophet ﷺ, that he was loved again by his uncles, although unfortunately he didn't have a father. So there's many incidents that we see from here. The first incident is where the Prophet ﷺ, still at this young age, once there was a big drought in Makkah, so there was no water coming. So Abu Talib, he and many of the other leaders of the Quraysh, remember Abu Talib is very respected among the Quraysh as well, or up until he passed away. So Abu Talib, he took many of the leaders of the Quraysh, he got them all together, and he took them to the Kaaba, and they made dua. And he took the Prophet ﷺ and he placed the Prophet ﷺ with his back to the Kaaba there. And at that time there was no clouds at all, nobody could see any clouds. And the Prophet ﷺ, he raised his finger like this. And as soon as he done this, then the whole sky, it became full of clouds. And within minutes it started raining. So the Prophet ﷺ, through his barakah, through his raising the finger, the drought went away. And this was something which brought a lot of attention to the Prophet ﷺ. And obviously Abu Talib, he gave a lot of praise to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said how the Prophet ﷺ, when he wants, he can draw whatever he wants from the treasures of Allah. So this is something we learn from a very, very young age, this was. So if you keep in mind that it was from the age of 8 that he was in the care of Abu Talib, so this happened about 9 or 10. After this, the first main incident, just to keep in mind, remember last week we started from the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, literally he was born. The week before was his grandfather's, his lineage, and the week before that was the area around him. All of these things are very important, but when we done our first overview, our aim was to encapsulate the whole scenario of the people of Makkah, like to have a good idea of it. So we spent 1 week just talking about the area of Makkah, what was going on at that time. But in reality, a better way of understanding the people of Makkah is actually through these kind of incidents. When Abu Talib, he takes the Prophet ﷺ to the Kaaba with all of the leaders of the Quraysh. What was the environment like? What was their belief? How did they understand Allah? What was their understanding of Allah? What was the actual shirk which they were doing? So we understand this fully from these kind of incidents. We can explain broadly, because in the first week we broadly explained the whole world literally in about half an hour. So we can have some understanding, but from each of these individual incidents, we noticed when the Prophet ﷺ, the nobility of his lineage, how people looked up to his grandfather, his father, and his whole family, his uncles, and they were all very, very respected. We see this. From this incident, for example, when Abu Talib, he's the leader there. He takes the Prophet ﷺ and he has the authority to put his nephew, such a young boy, against the Kaaba and to use him as a means of blessing. So this is the authority which Abu Talib had and the respect the Prophet ﷺ had. It's very important to realize that he didn't just have respect himself as a person. His respect was in his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather. He was the most noble lineage. And it's important to remember this because as soon as he declares Tawheed, as soon as he calls people to the one Allah, everybody feels free to throw stones at him and spit at him and throw dust at him. So we see that transformation happen from what he was to what he became. And all of this is understood when we study his lineage from his great-grandfather. This is how much respect he has. This is the family he was born into. So all of these give us a background. We do go through this very, very quickly. Just to be, for these years 1 to 40, literally we've covered them in about 2 weeks. Last week we started birth and we got all the way till he was 8. Now 8 till about 35 we'll probably cover today. So we cover them very quickly. But the stories and the points are very important. And also, going back to the second lesson, if you remember, the reason we're studying Seerah is because of our love for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we should want to know everything about his life from the moment he was born, everything that happened in his life, how he became the person he was. Because if we look at him as a role model as a whole, and overall he's the best person there, what was it about his life, even while growing up, that made him the person that he was? So all of this is relevant in some way. Some of us find it a bit boring because we want to talk about the battles and his fights and his troubles and the things that he went through. Some of us want to talk about, but obviously that will come. But all of this background, it gives us a much deeper understanding of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, what he was, what made him.
What kind of Nisa? Black Nisa.
So this is the first thing which you realize from the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Talib took him to the Kaaba and put him up against the Kaaba. He made dua and he was accepted by Abu Talib and the people there. So this is the first incident which you find happened about 10. Then the second thing which will happen, if you're looking at the handout, the second heading, when the Prophet ﷺ went to Syria. So Abu Talib, he had the habit of generally going to Syria because he was a trader. So now it was a very difficult journey to travel, especially that time. Nowadays we don't want to travel far because we have to stay away from home, even though we have so much luxury in our travels. There, traveling from Mecca to Syria took months, and you wouldn't have air conditioning on the way, you wouldn't have anything to save you. So taking a 12-year-old was something which wasn't the normal thing to do. So originally Abu Talib was going to go by himself, but the Prophet ﷺ asked him that he wants to really come. So originally he was going to go without the Prophet, but then he eventually took the Prophet ﷺ with him. So he took the Prophet ﷺ. And on their way to Syria, there's a place called Basra. And there, that's where the incident happens, where the Prophet ﷺ, he sees the monk. So there's different narrations explaining this incident. And with Seerah, another point to mention, there's a difference between Seerah and Hadith. When we study a Hadith, we can directly look at the chain of it and decide, is the chain of this Hadith authentic or not authentic? If it's not authentic, we'll usually reject and not look at the Hadith. With Seerah, the stringency is lessened. It's not as strict. You can take stories in Seerah without having to have so much authenticity to the narration. So for example, this narration of this incident, when the Prophet was 12, he went to Syria and the monk met him. This incident, the authenticity is not as strong as usually we'd have. But the story has lessons for us, and it's something which has been passed down. And the reason we carry on narrating it is because, like we mentioned at the beginning, we have books for hadith which contain hadith, and many of them are authentic only. But there's a separate section, if you go to a library, there's a separate section for Seerah. And the experts of Seerah wrote those books. So what they included, we will understand that the rules of Seerah and what is acceptable in Seerah is decided by the experts of Seerah when they wrote their original books. So if they included it, we'll carry on that. This is something which happened in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and we'll pass it on for our knowledge as well. So this story, again, there's different narrations. Then Abu Musa Ash'ari, he mentions after he became a Muslim, and he recalls the incident after he became a Muslim. The Abu Talib, he went to Syria on this mission, and on their way they used to usually camp at Basra. They used to usually sit there. Now the monk was always there, the Buhaira, he was always there as a monk. But on one specific incident, he came out and he analyzed and scrutinized everybody's face and looked at everybody very, very carefully. And he was looking for something. So then he looked at the Prophet ﷺ, and then he realized this is the person. He looked at the Prophet ﷺ. He recognized the Prophet ﷺ. Now he was a monk, Christian monk, but he was also, he was acquainted with his with the books, with the divine books of Christianity. So he would read the books, and he had realized the signs of the prophethood. He saw them in the Prophet ﷺ. And many miracles happened there. So when he came and said that this person's a prophet, the leaders of the Quraysh who were in this caravan said, how do you know? He's our person, he's a Qurayshi, he's from our lineage, we know better than you. He said, how do you know he's a prophet? That was the question there. And then he said that there's many miracles I've seen right now today which indicate on his prophet. While you were walking to this specific individual, the trees were and the boulders were all bowing before this individual. And this doesn't happen for anybody by a prophet. When the Prophet ﷺ, now this Buhaira, he respected and revered this whole caravan because of the Prophet ﷺ, to the extent he fed them all. So he gave them all a meal. Now the Prophet ﷺ wasn't there, so obviously he was outside. This wasn't, he didn't have a big house, but he had his own quarters where he lived, but the meal happened outside. So now the Prophet ﷺ, when he wasn't there for the meal, they called him and he came. But because he was late, there was no space in any of the shade. So everybody takes the shade. It's the desert, they're traveling. So there was no shade. So the Prophet ﷺ, he sat down on the side, and the tree itself, it came to the Prophet ﷺ. Other narrations mention that while the Prophet ﷺ was walking back he was grazing outside, when he came back, a cloud was giving him shade as well. So these are all different signs which were seen at that time. And the Prophet ﷺ, he came. Then Buhaira, he fed everyone, and after this he asked who is in charge of the Prophet ﷺ, who's his guardian. And he said that it's best you take him back to Mecca to be safe, because the Prophet ﷺ, the Romans are also going to be after him, because they also were Christians, so they would know that the Prophet ﷺ was going to come. They'll also be looking for him. And other narrations mention that in the same breath, in the same time, as Buhaira was saying that, he's noticed some Romans were in the distance looking for something, looking very carefully for something. And they said that we are looking for the Prophet ﷺ. And when Buhaira asked them, and obviously the Romans, Buhaira said to Abu Talib that if you don't take him back to Makkah and the Romans find him, the Romans will kill him. The Romans will put him to death. There's no doubt about that. So to be safe, take him back to Makkah. The Romans are in search for this. So these 7 Romans that were coming in search of the Prophet ﷺ, when they found Buhaira convinced them to settle down with him and actually become people of God. They actually became better. They stayed there and they stopped looking for him. And then the Prophet ﷺ was sent back to Makkah. So this is the general story which we find about this original incident. When the Prophet ﷺ was 12 years old, he went to, and on the way he stopped at Basra, and the monk Buhaira had this incident. And this is the first main incident. Like I mentioned, the issue we have is before the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet, nobody was particularly overly interested in the Prophet ﷺ. So nobody recorded his life from birth till 40. These incidents, most of them, when I mention them to you, a lot of them are from narrations which were mentioned after prophethood. A lot of them, in fact, in Medina. Because in Makkah, the Prophet ﷺ still wasn't considered an authority so much, because many people accepted him as a prophet, but they hadn't seen much, so they wouldn't recall incidents of the past as much. So many of these happen 50, 53, 55, 60 years later. These narrations are actually recorded, where people are just recalling an incident which happened in the past. And obviously that doesn't happen too much. So these incidents, these stories, from year 1 to 40, there's only 5 or 6 main stories we're going to mention, and the rest of it, there's some narrations there, but we're not going to mention them too much. So these are the first 2 incidents. The first, the dua one, where the Prophet ﷺ went to do dua, and the clouds came and rain come. Second one is this, where he went to Syria and they saw the signs of prophethood on him. The third incident is Harb al-Fujjar, which is the unholy wars which took place. And this is something which we know, we learnt this in our 3rd week when we spoke about the world at the time of the Prophet ﷺ's birth. The world was not a good place, especially in Makkah. People used to fight for no apparent reason whatsoever. They used to love fighting. So these Harb al-Fujjar, they reached a climax when the Prophet ﷺ was about 15 to 20. The Prophet ﷺ, obviously the fight was between the Quraysh and another tribe. So the Prophet ﷺ, because he was part of the Quraysh, his uncles expected him to participate in the war as well. Now generally nobody considered this to be a noble act or a noble thing for the Prophet ﷺ to do, to the extent people say that his only participation was to pass the arrows. Eventually the Quraysh won the war anyway. So the Prophet, and eventually this war, it stopped because of a truce. So they ended up having a truce with the opposition and they stopped fighting. So the Prophet ﷺ was very young and he was expected to participate here as well. And when he participated, his job was to just pick up the arrows and give it to his uncles, and they would shoot the arrows. So this stopped these, the Harb al-Fujjar, the reason they're called that is because even the Arabs, they had respect for the 4 sacred months. So in these 4 months they wouldn't fight. But in this Fujjar one, they became so fajr. Fujjar is the plural of fajr. So they became so ignorant, so evil, that even in the holy months they were fighting against the other people. Usually they would not fight in these months. So this is why it was called. And then they had a truce at the end of it. So after this, now the Prophet ﷺ coming up 20, after a bit older now, the next thing is the Hilf al-Fudul. So Harb al-Fujjar, the unholy wars. And Hilf al-Fudul, Hilf literally means the alliance which was made, the treaty which was come together, the truce they had. Because what happened is after the wars there was still some fighting going on. But they had originally come to a truce. So the Prophet ﷺ and other Sahaba, the main person behind is one of the uncles of the Prophet ﷺ. Last week we mentioned the famous uncles. Another uncle is Zubayr, who was also one of the brothers. He was the main pioneer of this Hilf, of this alliance which took place. There were two reasons, we put both reasons here. Number one was a follow-on, because Hurub al-Fujjar took place, these fights took place, and when these fights were taking place, after this they had a truce. So they didn't want to lose this truce. They already had peace, so they wanted to keep peace. So to properly entrench the peace, they made a treaty between everyone. This is one reason. Another reason, which is sometimes narrated, is this was for two reasons. One, to stop violence, and one, to also stop injustice. So what happened is, from outside of Makkah, a merchant came and he sold his goods to one of the Makkans. His name was As bin Wa'il. So As bin Wa'il, he bought some goods from this person. Now when he bought the goods, he refused to pay the person and kept the goods. Now this merchant who'd come from outside Makkah, he pleaded to the people of the Quraysh that help me basically, and most people just ignored him, because As bin Wa'il was a leader and you can't really say much to him. So this is what eventually happened. So, however, he carried on calling the people, and eventually some of the kind-hearted people, they took notice of him. And they said that, let's pay attention to him. And they took notice of him to the extent that they made this alliance. And the alliance came together, the people came together, they went to As bin Wa'il's house and they took back the goods and they gave it back to this merchant. And this is from that point, that's where the treaty was established. So that whenever somebody is violated or oppressed, even if they're weak, we as a treaty, as an alliance, as a group of people, as confederates who come together, we will make sure that justice is served. So this was one of the aims of this alliance. That's one of the reasons it was established. We mentioned at the bottom that Abdullah bin Jad'an, he eventually didn't become Muslim, but he was known for having a very big involvement in this. He invited everyone to his house. He fed all of the delegates of this truce. Obviously the people who are going to come together have to be quite powerful. You're not going to get a slave to come and say, I'm going to help you, because there's not really much help. So the powerful people had to come. Abdullah bin Jad'an fed all of them. He called everyone to his house. And the Prophet ﷺ himself was also present when the truce took place. So he would have been in his early 20s at this time. So in fact the narration mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, after Medina, even in a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions that during the launch of this pledge, I was there in Abdullah bin Jad'an's house. And then he said that even when he became Muslim, he said even if now this same Hilf al-Fudul was to happen, all the way in Medina life, he said that if I was to be given red camels, I would still not give up this hilf. This was a very, very good thing which happened at that time. So he established peace and order at that time, and he established justice for the weak people. So the Prophet ﷺ, later we find in a hadith, he mentions this as well, that how fortunate he felt that to be involved in the Hilf al-Fudul. So again, we find that this is something which is important to be involved in, even though the people making the truce were mushrikeen, they were not Muslims. But the Prophet ﷺ, something good is happening. Even if the pioneers are not Muslims, the pioneers are not people who are always going to be, who are not believing in Allah, but still to be involved and to participate in these things is something good. So obviously living in this country, we find opportunities like this very often, that we can be part of certain charities, we can be part of certain community groups, neighborhood watch, all of these kind of things, which look out for each other, look out for the people that are oppressed. And even though the pioneers may not be Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ, after prophethood, still says that going back in time, I would still agree with this hilf as well. So this is the thing that we learn from the Prophet ﷺ. The next thing, going on to the back, is the early occupation, the occupation of the Prophet ﷺ. So fundamentally from his character, the Prophet ﷺ was known to have the best character from all of the people. And here we find many narrations. Again, these narrations which you're going to mention are from Sahaba. As in the Sahaba moved to Medina, they done hijrah with the Prophet ﷺ, and then almost reminiscing about the days of Jahiliyyah, they would say X, Y and Z. So the first is from Abdullah bin Abi Hamasa radiallahu anh. He says that before prophethood, I once engaged in a trade with the Prophet ﷺ. So he had a transaction with the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ he gave him something, so he owed the Prophet ﷺ some money. So he said to the Prophet ﷺ, wait here, I will give you the money in a short time, just wait here and go and get it. However, this Abdullah, radiallahu anh, he completely forgot about this and he didn't come back. For 1 day, for 2 days, for 3 days. For 3 days he completely forgot about this. So 3 days later he came back to that same place. And he rushed there and he found the Prophet ﷺ 3 days later was still waiting for him there, very patiently waiting. So when he came to the Prophet ﷺ, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, you know that I've been very late, and he apologized. Prophet ﷺ, he didn't get angry with him, he didn't say anything to him. All he said that you put me through a lot of difficulty. Obviously he's had to stay there for 3 days waiting for him. But what the main point we notice from here is that the Prophet ﷺ, when he said, I will stay here, I will be here on time, the Prophet ﷺ himself, even before prophethood, his fitrah, his general nature was to make sure that he fulfilled his word of the promise, that I will stay here, I'll be here for you. So then he took 3 days to come back, but the Prophet ﷺ was still there. And the Sahaba recount this incident. Another narration is Abdullah bin Sa'ib, radiallahu anhu, a different Sahabi. He mentions that and they mention this, and then the way they narrate the hadith is that in the period of ignorance. So in Jahiliyyah, fil Jahiliyyah, when it was the Jahiliyyah time. So this is how they would narrate this. So he mentions in Jahiliyyah, I used to trade with the Prophet ﷺ, and then the Prophet ﷺ came to meet me and asked him that, do you remember me? And the Prophet he said that, of course I remember you, because the Prophet ﷺ, he had such brilliant character that you could never forget that kind of character. He'd be so perfect in every way, he'd be so useful. You wouldn't want to forget somebody like this. And the last hadith is from Qais bin Sa'ib. And he mentions that in Jahiliyyah I was a business partner of the Prophet ﷺ, and again he praised the Prophet ﷺ's qualities of business partners. Also, what else we learn is that despite the Prophet ﷺ, being the way he was and calling to, in this time the Prophet ﷺ, he was known as Al-Amin, he was known as the trustworthy. So obviously these 3 narrations tell us that people used to trade with him, people used to deal with him, and people used to spend time with him. So while trading, now generally when somebody opens a shop or opens a business, generally we find that these people, they sometimes cheat, sometimes do something wrong. But the Prophet ﷺ, despite having many trading partners, trading all the way across the world, from Arabia to Syria, going there and back and doing all these trades, his title became the Al-Amin, that one person to look out for who's trustworthy. And this is one thing we learn from the Prophet ﷺ, that his character would be on point always, with everyone. He wouldn't give anybody an excuse to not trust him in any way. So again, one of the downfalls of the Muslim Ummah which we see today, even in this country, if you want to buy a car and you find out Pakistan is selling the car, you won't buy it because you know that he's going to lie about it. Generally, when we know, if we try and buy a car, we try and find a British person to buy the car off, or a Polish person, or a Romanian person. If you've got a house and you want to rent the house out to someone, you don't want to find, generally, to put it bluntly, you don't want to find a Muslim to live in the house. You want to find other people, because they'll give you trouble. They won't pay the rent, they'll break the house, they'll demand ridiculous things for the house. Whenever we want to deal, we prefer to take non-Muslims, generally, because for those of us that run businesses, we know this. For those of us that have had to deal with people, we've had to buy things of value, even phones and all of these things, we prefer to deal with non-Muslims, unfortunately, because it's the way that Muslims come across, because we know that they're not trustworthy. And obviously if you look at our countries and the governments, we look at the corruption which exists right from the top. And because of this corruption, we have different problems in our countries. And people complain about it in different ways about different countries. Like here, you go to the NHS and you see, all the nurses, all the members of staff, they all have access to the medicine. You don't have to lock up the medicine. You go back to our countries and you go to the hospital, the medicine has to be locked up because the average member of staff cannot be trusted to not sell it to a random person who walks in. So this is the differences that we find in trust, honesty, and then advancement in the world. If you want to have a forward society, you have to, if you're going to blame Islam, we have to look at the fundamentals of the Prophet ﷺ. This was his natural fitrah, even before a prophet. To be the best, to be honest, and to have that title of Al-Amin within Makkah, that he became famous, people would refer to him as this. People would say, Allah is going past Al-Amin, we can trust him. Even after he became a prophet, people would leave this. So this is obviously something which we learn living in our society. not only are we ambassadors for Islam, but also we ourselves, we learn from Islam itself. So if we learn Islam properly, we can propagate Islam the way it's meant to be propagated. But unfortunately, sometimes we forget, and sometimes, the way we drive as well, the way we get around, the way we look after other people, sometimes, last time I was driving my car, it's very rare that I'll find a British person who annoys me while driving, who overtakes you and, drives too fast, always going through red lights for no reason whatsoever. These kind of things, unfortunately, we find it in some people that come to this country from outside. They think it's okay. Because in our countries it's okay, isn't it? There's no problem. You don't have any lanes, you don't have any civilization at all. So when we come here, we try and just carry on without realizing that when the light is red, you have to stop. And when there's 2 lanes and that lane's going this way, you don't drive that way in this lane, because that's dangerous. And even if you may think it's okay, but other people will not like you because of that. And people see that this is Muslim doing this, because unfortunately we are ambassadors for Islam. Regardless whether we want to be or not, if we're in this country, we're going to be ambassadors in our colleges, in our schools, in our universities. Every transaction we made, when we walk into the shop, when we walk into a pharmacy, when we go to hospital, the way we talk, the way we come across, we're representing Islam. This is our main da'wah as well in itself. If we come across with good manners, British people say sorry all the time. Unfortunately, some of us, we don't have that within us. When they walk around, sometimes, I go out after Fajr sometimes, and these people, they'll always say good morning to you, and they'll smile at you. And we're taught to say that fundamentally from Islam, to smile at people and to say salam, but very often we don't. Anyway, so that was not part of the script. Crazy good. So next thing, the occupation. Just one side thing. The Prophet ﷺ had trading. Also, one thing he done is he grazed goats. And this is something which develops, hard work, manual labor. So nowadays, this is the manual labor of that time. In our countries, many of our relatives may do this, but grazing the animals, it creates some kind of, it creates kind of humility inside a person. This is something which the Prophet ﷺ done. Again, these are narrated in hadith. After the Prophet ﷺ went to Medina, people asked him that, did you used to graze goats? And the Prophet ﷺ said, not just me, all of the prophets used to graze goats. And in another narration, the Prophet ﷺ said that every prophet used to graze goats, and the Prophet ﷺ said that yes, even I used to graze the goats, and for a few small amount of money which he used to get for grazing the goats. So this is something he also did, as well as trading. He also used to do trading is something which is, the Prophet ﷺ was very good at it. He was extremely good, so he would do very well there. But as well as having a very good job, he would also give himself some hard labor to do as well. So this is something we should think about, that we try and do something which gives you a bit of ajziz. Sometimes clean some toilets, or do some cleaning, do some hard work, do some lifting. So these kind of things which help us have some kind of humility inside ourselves as well. Make ourselves make ourselves follower of somebody else. That we offer ourselves for some kind of service, to paint the mosque, to whatever we want to do, we offer ourselves for these kind of services. Which means that if you offer yourself and you volunteer, you have to do what you're told. It's not the most fun that you don't just go around, making patterns wherever you want in the mosque. You have to do what you're told. It's not amazingly fun. But when you make this sacrifice and you make this is something which we may have a very high job. We may sit in an office doing, just telling people what to do. But when a person puts himself, and recently there was a video of, Sadio Mane doing that. For those of that may have seen that, despite being a footballer who's on, hundreds of thousands of pounds every year, he went to the masjid and he decided, he didn't, take his camera crew with him. Somebody just videoed him. But he was in the masjid and he was cleaning the toilets. So, we learn from these kind of experiences. And then after this, the Prophet ﷺ, he carried on trading. And what we notice is that the Prophet ﷺ, he became well known in Makkah for being Al-Amin. He was the most trustworthy. Now obviously we know the Prophet ﷺ got married at the age of 25. So in this age of 22, 23, he became known. And when he was 25, Khadija radiallahu ta'ala, she noticed the Prophet ﷺ, and she was a big kind of investor, so to speak. She used to do mudaraba. She used to find people, give them her wealth. They used to trade it for her and give her the profit. So Khadija radiallahu anha, she obviously heard about the Prophet ﷺ, and when he was 25, she found him. And she wrote him a letter and said, can you please do some trading for me? She requested him to do some trading for him. So the Prophet ﷺ accepted. So she gave him the stuff, and the Prophet ﷺ went from Makkah to Syria and traded for Khadija. And Khadija radiallahu anha, she also gave her slave, Maysara, who went with the Prophet ﷺ. She helped with some of the stuff. This is important because Seerah will now obviously report back to Khadija everything she sees. So the Prophet ﷺ, again, another incident, when he went to Basra, again, another monk found him and told him that he's a prophet. But this is something very similar to the original incident of the monk. But this does happen again. But many miracles happen. So Seerah, she mentions that when it was very, very hot in the afternoons, I would notice angels would come and shade the Prophet ﷺ. And to the extent that when the Prophet ﷺ was coming back from this journey, Khadija radiallahu anha saw him from far away, and even she noticed that he was being shaded by invisible things. So either a cloud or some angels were shading the Prophet ﷺ. And Seerah saw many extraordinary things. So the slave that went off Khadija, she saw many extraordinary feats the Prophet ﷺ achieved. That you achieved this, you achieved this. And she's told all this to Khadija radiallahu anha. So then when the Prophet ﷺ actually went, because he was very good at his job, he actually came back with more money than Khadija had ever expected. So he made so much profit that Khadija radiallahu anha, before he went, had already fixed this amount. He made so much profit that she increased her award to the Prophet ﷺ, and she paid him extra because that's how well he did. So now when Khadija radiallahu anha, this is moving on to the next part, the marriage, the very last part in fact, that the Prophet ﷺ, when he got married to Khadija radiallahu anha, because she listened to what Seerah said to her, and he learned all of these things. So she listened to all of this, and she heard what the monk said to the Prophet ﷺ, and she told all of this to Waraka bin Nawfal, who was actually related to Khadija radiallahu anha, who was known as his uncle. So she went to her uncle, who was a very, very Christian priest basically, and she told him all of this big story, big miracles about the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, because he also was a priest, so he knew as well. So he said he would be a prophet. So then he went and he told, and when Khadija radiallahu anha found this out, she definitely wanted to get married to the Prophet ﷺ. So she eventually proposed to the Prophet ﷺ. And remember, the Prophet ﷺ is still, he's 25, but still he's taking mashwara, he's taking guidance from his elders. He's not his own man. He doesn't consider himself to make his own decisions whenever he feels like. So he takes the mashwara of Abu Talib, obviously his main guardian, and the rest of the elders which he used to take advice from. And they all said that this is a good idea to go ahead with the marriage with Khadija radiallahu anha. And obviously Abu Talib, he recited the nikah for the Prophet ﷺ between him and Khadija radiallahu anha. And the Prophet ﷺ was 25 still, and Khadija was 40 years old at this time. And the mahar which was given to the Prophet ﷺ was about 500 dirhams. So mahar, unfortunately, there's no English word for mahar. Some people like to call it the dowry, but obviously the dowry is what the wife gives to the husband. So it's the complete opposite. So the dowry is what the wife gives to the husband. So in English we don't really have a word for mahar. You can maybe find one. One of my teachers, he was thinking to add a word to the he's added about 3 or 4 words to the Cambridge dictionary. So he's thinking of one, inshallah. He'll do it soon. He's a doctor, he lives in Manchester. But he's thinking to work on this. But at the moment, because in English culture there's no such thing as mahar. The husband doesn't give anything to the wife. In Islam, we have a responsibility. You have to give a fixed amount to the wife. You have to. So the Prophet ﷺ gave 500 dirhams. So now this is necessary whenever we get married that we give this, and we fix a sensible amount which we.
So when you said dowry, is from the girl, is it?
In English, yes. On the girl, but people are confused nowadays. So.
Yeah, because normally in Islam it's a man give it to the wife and another other way around.
Yeah, so dowry is usually the gifts which the parents of the girl
the English thing
will give. Yeah, usually.
Yeah, so Islam is the man gift.
Islam, yeah. So we call it mahar. We'll try and always use it whenever we go. We call it mahar, and we keep this word. And this is very, very important. And the Prophet, remember, this is the first time the Prophet ﷺ ever got married. He'd been completely pure before this. Also, Khadija radiallahu anha, she was not a minor woman either. As we know, she was extremely wealthy. She used to send her wealth to invest it and bring it back. She was very wealthy. She was also known as pure as well. She was known as Tahira, because she had nobility. She had a very, very noble lineage. And also, the other reason she was known as Tahira was because she was very, very chaste. She didn't used to sleep around. She was very, very pure as a person. So this is why